So this event is part of the work of IPPO. Many of you will know IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory. We mainly work on evidence synthesis around all sorts of topics, from net zero to social inequalities to working from home. Last week, a session on how to run society-wide conversations. And we're running this separate series on innovation, on evidence methods. Last month, we held a session on the use of generative AI, large language models to synthesize evidence. That's available if you're interested. Next month, we have one on transferability. How do you know if something works in one place, that it will work in another place? And there'll be a series of others over the next few months. Today, we're focusing in on the use of systems maps. These have been around in different forms for many, many decades. But I think they've become increasingly popular because people realize so many of the phenomena we're dealing with are complex, are interconnected, are systemic. They're not easily captured just by written prose, even though that is still the main medium for governments and academics. But it's not a very good way to understand complexity. We actually held a session 3 years ago on systems mappings, and there's a paper which was prepared for that. Now we're really keen to see what can be done to use these to the best effect for helping decision makers in policy. How do you understand the relationship of system dynamics to power and to evidence? And I hope we'll get some new insights today. Before we go to our main speakers, I'm going to ask my colleague Jeremy just to give a quick burst on the little short paper we did together, trying to explain some of the methods we're using for systems mapping. And we may, of course, change our mind by the end of this hour. But Jeremy, quick burst from you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, here, systems maps are part of our kind of core offer to policymakers. But there's also something quite new for us as well. So Jeff and I put together something called the SEPA method, which we've outlined in a paper which has been distributed around to you all as attendees. Also, the link is in the chat. SEPA stands for Systems, Evidence and Power for Policy Action. It's our intention here to reproduce systems map with the idea that policymakers themselves can use them in their day-to-day decision making, thinking about the evidence landscape as a whole over a topic. This has kind of 5 stages of this process, and we've been using this some work we're currently doing on converting office space to housing, the issues around that. The first stage is a kind of initial brainstorm where you sketch out the system. We did it yesterday in an analog form, so we covered the wall in paper and had pens and stuff, brainstorming it. After that, you then bring in experts and stakeholders to kind of populate that. After that, you then try and overlay the evidence, including indication of strength evidence on top of that. Then you work with policymakers to design potential policy options and then refine that through that process. So we think no one's done it this way before, but we are still very humble. So we'd be very happy to hear your kind of thoughts on the paper and on the process as it goes on. And some of you may be involved in the individual systems maps which we're going to be producing on a variety of topics across IPPO's work programme. But that's enough from us. We're very happy that we have some excellent systems map speakers today. We're looking forward to hearing them. Jeff.
Thanks, Jeremy. And yeah, and our exercise, our first stage is ultra analog, just bits of paper on walls and very, very complicated and messy. It then goes digital. And I think one of the things we'll be looking at throughout this session is how do you get the right level of complexity without drowning in the complexity? If it's too simple, it's simplistic. If it's too complex, no one can use it for decisions. And that's a difficult balance. Anyway, we've got some fantastic presenters and lots of links to their own work, both through the IPPO website and in the chat. And our first speaker is Alex Penn from CECAN, who very much lives and breathes what we're talking about here. So Alex, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So yes, I'm Alex Penn from CECAN, Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, and I'm here to talk to you about our actionable complexity approach and the systems mapping work we've done in policy. So systems maps are commonly used to give an overview of the complex structure of policy problems, but one of the real problems here is they often actually, rather than providing us with insights, they provide overwhelming complexity and paralysis rather than ways to get a handle on the system. So this is the horrendogram, the obesity foresight map. To try to overcome these problems, we developed an actionable complexity approach. So we try to move from overwhelming to actionable complexity. This has 3 stages. stakeholder-owned and constructed models, which capture what matters on the ground, analysis which highlights key practical implications of system complexity and challenges users' assumptions, so actionable insights, and then facilitating an ongoing process with users asking new types of questions, generating new analysis ideas as their complexity proficiency increases and we build their capacity through the process. There are many different types of systems mapping, all suitable for different types of problems and situations. We tend to use what we call participatory systems mapping, a method we've developed, causal systems mapping method with a collaborative map construction, very inclusive, allows us to include diverse stakeholders' knowledge and perspectives, whatever people think is important, and qualitative and quantified data, very useful where large parts of the system we don't have data for. But crucially, we can do meaningful, usable analysis and generate insights from this map. So one of the big pieces of work we've done in CECAN using this method was with DEFRA on the Future Farming and Countryside Programme, very large-scale policy programme when all of the agricultural policy in the UK was coming back to the UK government post-Brexit, very complex policy landscape undergoing rapid change. And we were looking at linking ex-ante analysis and policy planning with evaluation here. So this very large map, this horrendogram that you can see here, we generated with the policy teams, combining 4 large policy areas. It started from what mattered to them. The yellow factors here are policy outcomes, all of the different policy outcomes in the space. But importantly, to make sure we captured what mattered on the ground, we also included all of these red factors, which are what matters to different stakeholders in the system, farmers, land managers, rural communities. We then added in with our policy teams, all general factors from any domain, whatever they felt mattered that influenced or was influenced by these factors. And then finally, when we have the big system, we allow them to add in the policies. So it's very much system first, policy last, to really kind of get the perspective right. This was a 2-year large-scale co-production process, but at the heart of this was these kind of workshops that Jeff's talking about, getting people together in a room, building maps and getting them round the table and getting their insights and understanding down into the maps. To produce the actionable insights that I was talking about and get away from that hairball overwhelming complexity, we use what we call subjective network analysis. So we pull out submaps, subsections of the network map, which tell stories and provide actionable insights. There's a lot of detail in how we do this, but usually we're starting from factors that matter to stakeholders, a policy, an important outcome or outcomes, or things that analysis suggests are structurally important in the system by doing network analysis. We'll pull out different types of submaps based on the kinds of questions that we want to answer, what influences something, what are interactions, this kind of thing. And then we combine it with stakeholder information on the factors and links. What who's controlling a given factor? What's controllable by who? What's important to who? What are things changed by? How much evidence have we got, etc. And then we interrogate these submaps for implications and to think through design responses. So there's a lot of types of analysis we can do, but we frame the analysis, the network analysis we do, with questions that matter to our users. So these questions: what might be a risk to the program? What might be an opportunity or policy lever? What trade-offs might exist in the program? And how does an intervention affect the system? Generated by our DEFRA policy team. So our analysis fits those questions that they want to answer. So unfortunately, I can't actually give you the detail of the maps. I can't show you the labels on our maps, but here's some examples of that kind of analysis in general terms. So here we have a very influential factor in the system, the most influential factor. We can pull out the submap around that. We can see that it influences many outcomes important to stakeholders. If we go a step further out from that, we can see it influences many policy outcomes. But when we look at what influences it and ask the question, can we control this? We see it's controlled by policies, but those policies are owned by other government departments. So this is a big vulnerability for DEFRA, and pulling this out actually led to the redesign of delivery of various policies in that space to try to buffer against that vulnerability. We also did a lot of work looking at what feeds into policy outcomes. So for different policy outcomes, what's outside the eye line of the policy team. So looking upstream from a policy, we can see all of the different factors, stakeholder interests, other policies that influence that, which may not be being taken account of in the policy design, and we can work to try to integrate those into design. As the team progressed, they started to do their own forms of analysis. So trade-offs and synergies between policy outcomes were very important to them. And what's been very useful for them is they took the logic models that they were already using within the program and pulled out or integrated those with the map to be able to demonstrate the complex contexts that surrounded those linear logic models. So they could then see the feedbacks, the influences, the unexpected indirect effects that actually surrounded those logic models. So it made it usable if they're normal formats, but put the complexity into the picture. All of this was part of an iterative co-production process in which we worked on capacity building with our policy teams throughout, training them how to use the methods so that when we stepped away, they have a living document. They're able to update the map, to analyze it, to design new analysis methods. So we have a living document and a living process that's still being used in DEFRA today. So finally, there are many kinds of systems mapping. The type you choose is going to depend on the nature of the problem, the time you've got, the stakeholders' challenges, all sorts of different things. So don't be fixated on a type. But I mean, what we've really found in our work is that what's been really helpful in making this kind of actionable is guiding people on an unfolding complexity journey. So setting up co-production processes that lead to sustainable changes in thinking, designing mapping processes appropriately so that we're listening to and understanding the context and challenges of our users, as well as their blind spots, and bringing those out in the process. Using what fits really to make this work. Producing aha moments early on. So really from the start, you will need to be showing what systems mapping can give them, why they should care about complexity, producing actionable insights and the co-design of analysis to ensure this, and then really crucially building in capacity building, designing that in from the start, transferring ownership through the process so that the models are living documents and you create processes that have a life of their own. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. And there's lots more material on the CECAN website and indeed in the book, which Alex showed. Do please keep the questions coming in the chat and links to examples. We'll try and cover quite a few of those questions, I hope, including the different softwares available. I mean, things like Kumu were not around 10 years ago. We've got much better, freer tools to build on. Answers to this question of what is requisite complexity, how do you keep things simple enough? Is it 7 plus or minus 2? The old psychology idea. And if anyone has examples from the COVID crisis, that would be great. The inquiry is on at the moment. Not a single witness has mentioned systems maps, I think, so far. Maybe that would have helped them make better decisions. Who knows? Our second speaker is Viliana Dzhartova, who has produced what we thought was some really fantastic systems maps. So over to you, Viliana, and your puppy is in the background, but hopefully staying quiet.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, if you hear a little bit of barking, I'm sorry about it. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I would love to share a little bit about our systems mapping and also just to share how much the field has grown since we first started 4 years ago in our first map, kind of begging and trying to convince people in the value of system maps. And now it's really, there is a whole field there and people are coming to us asking for maps across all sectors, which is really, really nice to see. So what we do at Reimagined Futures is we really bring systems thinking tools to decision makers to help them put systems thinking into practice. And systems mapping is one of our tools, actually the most popular, the most loved ones, but we use other tools like Three Horizons and multi-level perspective, etc. And they are very, very useful for policymaking as well. And we do use them with our work with the Catalan government here. So I'm actually based in Catalonia, so I will share some examples of our regional government work here. We do work across sectors. So we have done systems maps on food, on early childhood development, healthcare, investment, etc. And we work with a variety of organizations and regional governments, collectives of investors are really interested to switch to more systemic investment, alliances of philanthropic organizations that really want to bring their resources to where they can impact most. And we have really built our methodology on the basis of the Omidyar Group methodology, which is out there for free. So I saw that there was a question about methodology. I would highly recommend the Omidyar Group. We have developed it further since then, but it has been a very important foundation for us. And we do use Kumu as a mapping tool. And the idea of our systems maps is really to help we help with systems thinking. It's practicing systems thinking. I would say that's our biggest value contribution. Then the second one I would say is around that participatory stakeholder engagement, which Alex, you also mentioned. Our maps take 9 to 12 months and are really based in participatory co-ownership approach. And it's a really huge value to everyone involved. And I think the important bit about the map is that everyone owns it afterwards. So we don't necessarily create it just for the government or just for that one client. It's people have used it across anyone who's participated in our mapping has actually used that map afterwards in their work, which has been really nice. We also, one of the biggest reasons for a map is to help you zoom out and really see the interconnectedness of the whole, how it's not just about the singular elements, but it's about these relationships that actually form the behavior of the system, so that the map really helps visualize that. And it also helps with storytelling. It helps with identifying potential paths for leverage. And ultimately, that's one of the big goals of a system map. We try to strike that balance between representing the complexity of the issues, because that is the reality, but also making it not too scary and off-putting. So I'll show you a couple of examples of system maps that we have done. I have also shared it on this channel, on the chat. I will share it again, but just very briefly, I don't have the time allocated for a proper example, but briefly I'll show you one map that we did here with the Catalan government on the role of systems, the role of Catalonia's knowledge creation system in leading the transformation of the region towards a greener, more resilient, more just socioeconomic model. So this is really exploring the role of universities and research centers, and how can they support this new emerging socioeconomic model. This is how the final map look like. So it's, obviously it is still complex, and it still has arrows, and it still has pluses and minuses, but we've tried to simplify it as much as possible. And at the middle, the biggest red kind of elements are really describing the main story that is answering the main systems dynamics that are at play, that are answering this question. And we're exploring here how the dominant socioeconomic model, I hope you can see a little bit at least, though I'm zooming in, is at the core of some of the global challenges that we're all facing, which has actually led to some questioning of that dominant model. On this side of the loops, we kind of explore the more negative responses to that questioning, and the resistance to change, and the structural inertia, the pressure from dominant groups, etc., and how basically things continue to be as they are, and there is more and more funds attracted by this traditional innovation framework. And then on the other side, we explore what's the reality now, the emerging reality in Catalonia, and how some of that questioning of the model and of the framework is leading to new frameworks. And there are some other factors and drivers for the emergence of these new frameworks for transformative innovation that are being now actually funded. and some new strategies are emerging, new understanding basically of societal challenges and what approaches are needed, and a little bit more systemic view. Some collaborations are emerging, and we are seeing examples of transformative innovation that are actually challenging this traditional dominant socioeconomic model. So they're putting pressure on that model. And as you see here, so that pressure on the dominant socioeconomic model has three possible responses usually. The most common one is actually blocking these transformative innovations that are popping up. We see that a lot with the complications that some policy, for example, is happening around solar energy. So actually some governments are not necessarily that supportive of solar panels on every roof. And it's really blocking that innovation. Other possible responses of the dominant model is to capture these innovations and to just convert them into what is already into their paradigm. So an example for that will be how renewable energies is being really mainstreamed by big energy corporations, but really working with under the same paradigm of dominant kind of energy providers, consumers, etc. And we have a final possible response reaction here, which is the adoption of these innovations with the potential for system change. And we are thinking about examples such as the democratization of energy supply, for example, and kind of ownership of the individual ownership of energy, as well as collective ownership as a community. So this potential for system change is actually at the core of the development of this new socioeconomic model. This is just I finished with that one. I shared.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and there are lots of Viliana's put links to all of that material in the chat. We will also be gathering up all the content from the chat, all the links, all the different tools, and some training courses. And we'll circulate that afterwards as a shared resource. Thank you very much, Viliana. Our next speaker is Tom Hughes from National Infrastructure Commission, using systems mapping. Well, you run literally systems of all kinds. Well, you're involved in shaping systems of all kinds and applying these to policy. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and hi everyone. Thanks for having me today. What I'll do, I'll just sort of talk through quickly a bit of the experience that we have had using systems mapping before, and kind of how we went about it and what we learned from the process. So just as a very brief bit of kind of background and context before we start, just so people know who we are and sort of where we were coming from. So the National Infrastructure Commission is an executive agency of the UK government, and we provide the government with advice, independent advice on long-term economic infrastructure needs. So the important thing, I guess, on this slide is that final bullet point about our remit is to look at 30 years out, what are the strategic policy needs of the UK when it comes to economic infrastructure, which is the sector set out on this slide. And the particular piece of work I'm going to talk about today was one we did for a project back in 2019 and 2020, looking at the resilience of the utility sectors and transport. And I won't try and go through everything we were trying to do in this project here. But one of the things that we were trying to do as this piece of work is just synthesize some of the knowledge that's out there, give a better understanding of kind of how resilient the UK's infrastructure is, and kind of how well it performs at the moment, but also just to understand the system better, understand complexity and how different parts of the system interact with one another. And I've put the outputs in the last two bullet points there on the slide, but I'll maybe come back to those later once I've talked through, because I think they're sort of informed by some of the outputs of the mapping. So why did we start with the piece of systems mapping as part of this work? So as I said, this is really about, we wanted to get a better understanding of relationships and decisions across different parts of the relevant infrastructure systems, and understand how they interact together to actually deliver the level of service, the actual outcome in terms of kind of service provision, that those sectors have. And so understanding the relationships between those factors, but also the relationships between the different systems as well. So how does the energy system and the decisions made there about resilience start to interact with decisions about resilience in the transport sector, for instance, because that's increasingly important as transport electrifies and things like that. So understanding those relationships is kind of particularly important. And we went about this process. We worked with some consultants at Arup to do the work for us. And we started with very much a kind of basic starting point of kind of data collection, doing some desk-based research, talking to individual experts about this to kind of build up some individual pictures of the systems. And then we went through the sort of collaborative process others have been talking about to actually edit and kind of iterate those over time. So I'll kind of show you a little bit about how that process worked. So this is actually an output of one of the kind of exercises we did at the start of a workshop we had in the project, which was basically going, before we get into the detail of systems and into all sorts of complexity, just asking people, what are the connections between different aspects at a very, very high level of some of the infrastructure systems? And you can see here from the map, it already starts to tell you some stories about actually where are there kind of more and less interdependencies between different infrastructure systems related by the kind of size of the nodes on the diagram and also the thickness of the lines there. But you can already see from kind of very simple exercises, you can get some kind of insights and understanding of kind of how the systems work and interact with one another. And then in the actual workshop itself, there was a lot of, as I think already been shown on a couple of the other slides, lots of post-its, lots of maps, lots of people around kind of different tables feeding in and actually kind of testing a very initial version of a map, which you can, I think, just about see underneath all the post-its and scribbling there, and actually building up over time. So we've got a much richer picture of actually what are all the different points that we might have missed from that early work, what should we be bringing in together, and also moving some of it around, thinking about how you show the system, how does it actually work in a way that people will understand what you're showing them, because it's all very well having a great map, but if nobody understands what it is saying or can take a story from it, it's not very helpful. So we used that, and I think one of the really interesting things we did was we did an exercise with sectoral experts looking at their own maps, and then we rotated everybody around the table and mixed them up and got different experts from different sectors to talk about theirs and provide some kind of really quick and dirty challenge to some of this process, but also think about some of those interdependencies as well. And I think getting those different perspectives was a really useful exercise. And in the interest of time, I won't try and talk this through in great detail, but this is broadly the sort of map we ended up with. And there's lots of different ways of doing it, and there's some links that will go around to the maps where you can actually delve into these and have a look at the different views of them. But one of the interesting things that I think it kind of shows here is we sort of built up through learning the process that actually it really is about organizing things around the level of service provided, because one of the learnings we definitely took from this is decision making within infrastructure is really siloed. Like everybody says it all the time, but the process of developing these maps really gives a kind of neat graphical kind of evidence of how that's shown, and that's going to become more difficult over time. But it also means ultimately one of the key things you need to have aligned is actually what are those levels of service that different so different sectors rely on. If you are the transport sector and you are reliant on the power supply to run a train, you need to be confident in that level of kind of service. And actually, so having resilient standards and improving resilient standards that exist became one of the kind of key recommendations we made to government off the back of the work. And then just quickly, a few more sort of
very quickly, yeah.
Takeaways. I think there are a couple of things that I pick up. So one is think about this illustratively and think about how you show information on this is one of the lessons learned, because you can't show everything. You have to show things in a way that actually makes sense to people and simplify sensibly. And then just picking up on something else that has been said already, that valuing the process, the actual workshop exercises, working this through with everybody, developing that shared understanding between different people involved is really helpful exercise. And the maps were kind of particularly useful for that. And then just that final point there, I think diagnosing, not problem solving, is really important, because I think some of us went in with quite a high level of ambition, let's say, about what the systems mapping could achieve. And I think it helped us build understanding and inform the next set of work that we did. But it definitely won't tell you what the answer is. So I will stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much, Tom. And that point, they'll get you better questions, but on their own, they probably won't get you better answers. Maybe one we'll pick up in the question and answers later. Our final speakers are a double act, Alice Louka and Roisin Dillon, who you're going to divide your time as you wish, but we'll go straight over to you.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Louka, and I'll be speaking with Roisin Dillon as well. I recognise a few names on the call, so if you know me, hello. If you don't know me, nice to meet you. So I work at the Skoll Centre. We're based at the University of Oxford inside Business School, and we were set up 20 years ago with a generous grant from the Skoll Foundation. And our vision is that we see a world where social change is driven by people who embrace paradox. We work to bridge theory and practice and navigate those tensions between profit and purpose, and also aiming to find solutions within broken systems. So I've come to talk to you about Map the System, which is our student learning program. It's a global program where we provide a framework and a mindset to help students of all different levels to think differently about social and environmental issues. They apply these principles of systems thinking to try better understand complex challenges, and they create as an output visual systems maps to help articulate their findings in a way that people can meaningfully understand, share, and learn from, which is really key. And I saw a few questions about that as well. So that's something that we work to support students with. The communication is a really key part of this. But really at the core, we're encouraging students to look at what might be the underlying causes of these complex issues and using that as the foundation to drive this transformational change. So it's really about imagining a different kind of leadership. And instead of seeing students as leaders of tomorrow, they can be leaders now, and in all sorts of different ways. So at the Skoll Centre and in Map the System, we think that systemic global issues will not be solved by a lone genius or individuals. It's more about collectivism, and we need to work to foster this new kind of leadership and a different way of problem solving within higher education. And this systems approach we found has been really complementary to a lot of different disciplines. We've had students and educators from healthcare, business, policy backgrounds, all sorts, and it's beneficial to whatever they're working with. But we're really just hoping to give them this toolkit to look at both local problems and then maybe scale those to like national or more larger scale problems. But it's really key that they're looking at the interconnections of stakeholders and looking at patterns of behavior over time and those interconnections rather than just isolated events. And our goal is that through this approach that students can carry on this work. Some of them go on to do further studies in systems. Some of them, they carry on working on this. They might start their own social enterprise in the area that they start during Map the System. But really, it's just about empowering the students and them empowering others to develop this deep understanding of systems. The way that it works is that the students join this global learning community and they're given access to the systems thinking toolkit, and they also have access to Kumu, which you've already seen shown today. And they spend several months applying these and create these visual systems maps. And we encourage them to select local problems and involve external community partners in the region, such as NGOs, charities, or grassroots organizations. And we also ask students to think about lived experience and knowledge equity, and to be mindful that they're not picking a problem maybe that they really care about, but they're very separated from, because we shouldn't be speaking on others' behalf, and we should ensure we're including the voices of those who are actually impacted by this systemic challenge that they're wanting to tackle. So we've had over 138 universities have been part of MAP systems since we began in 2016, over 13,000 students, over 350 educators, and that includes academic, research, and professional staff. And we've worked with institutions across 37 countries and over 100 different nationalities. So it's been very global, and that photo is from this year's global final. So I'm shortly going to pass over to Roisin to talk a little bit about the work she did as part of MAP system, but just to give you an idea of the kind of projects that students look at, we have almost 1,000 teams a year usually, so really wide range. This year, the winners were from Wesleyan University in the US, and their project looked at the systemic problem of child marriage in Indonesia. And I wouldn't have time to go into detail. They create a really long set of systems maps, and they can use different models that we introduced to them. But this was just to give an idea of the kind of causal relationships that the students aim to uncover, and then they directly use these when they propose any suggested interventions on how we can move this forward. And then a really key part is thinking about who would they want to communicate with to make sure that these, like, the way forward is clear. So where they have worked maybe with a community partner, we encourage them then to go back and present their final project, and then maybe think about ways that the students can continue to support them. Another project we had last year, the winners were from the University of
You've got
Cape Town.
about 2 to 3 minutes for you and Roisin.
Okay, no problem. So this project was talking about the importance of access to financing for ownership in South Africa. And that was just an example of an iceberg model where they're trying to suggest interventions that hit the deep in the system rather than just at the top. So sorry, Roisin, you're not left with much time. But I'll pass over to you. Roisin won MAP system in 2018, and she has been an amazing example of carrying forward her work and went on to work in policy and has just begun her DPhil at the University of Oxford using a systems approach. So Roisin, I will hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Alice, and hello, everyone. Yes, let's just skip to the next slide because in the interests of time. So one of the things I think we've heard a lot from all of our speakers is the challenge of sort of translating complexity. So actually one of the strange approaches, I suppose you could say, I took in my map the system research was to not include my systems map. And instead what I did was actually try to categorize certain parts of that map and zoom into those. So here's 2 examples of how I did that. First and foremost, focusing on the why, how can I get other people to care about the issue that I'm talking about, which was the opioid crisis in Canada. I particularly focused on fentanyl. So I described there, a 2,600% increase in death rates in less than a decade, that it killed more people than motor vehicle accidents per year, and primarily really young people, so age 30 to 39. And then I talked about actually one of the most important component parts of that system being actually how it comes across our border. So the fact that our policies and our regulatory frameworks actually allow packages to move through our border system without inspection if they weigh under a certain amount. So is that a quick actionable change that we could take? And those are sort of things that I continue to focus on. I changed some policies at our local homeless shelters in Canada as a result of this project, including a very, very simple fix, which was to have doors open outwards instead of open inwards. So if someone experienced an overdose, emergency medical responders could get in and open that door towards them rather than towards the person who was perhaps indisposed. Could I have the next slide, please? I will canter through this one and right on to the next one just to say that this is typically some way in a means of how we think of policy development. We think of it as a cycle. It's sort of cyclical in nature. We typically do some iteration of these 4 things when we're doing policy work. And I'll go to the next slide and say actually that these are many of the tools that we might use when we're looking at taking forward a particular policy project. So including that lived experience, understanding that perhaps it's not about influencing, but convening power and how we bring people together. And rather than using your subject matter expertise, use your expertise to bring people into a room and understand how each of their varying expertise can help you better understand that system and potential outputs for that system. Things like behavior over time, power dynamics, and how all of those things sort of interact to help you identify component parts of the system that you may be able to have the most leverage or power over. I don't typically like to talk about problems and solutions in the space of systems mapping because I don't find it particularly helpful. Can I get the next slide, please, Alice? So just finally to say that I've sort of used these types of tools in policy work and also have just started my DPhil at the University of Oxford. We're taking a systems mapping approach. So we're looking at safety netting advice. So essentially when a practitioner provides netting advice to a patient, do they actually recall that information? Do they understand that information in the same way that the practitioner meant it? So do they know when to come back to seek emergency care? Do they know when to sort of seek care from their GP, for example? And did they actually understand that information the way that the practitioner intended it? So we're starting with a systems mapping approach. I'll be focused on actually children. So how does the relationship, even in the power dynamics with a parent and carer relationship with a child, influence the way that risk information is translated and things like that? So just wanted to give some practical examples of the way that you can approach certain projects. But I think we'll stop there in the interest of time and hopefully have time to take some questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Roisin. That was a fantastic example. And I've got a whole load of questions from the chat. And I'll rattle through maybe 5 or 6, and then we can go around and see who wants to answer which ones. So one is really what kind of topic or what kind of question is most suitable, and which kind of ones aren't actually very good for systems mapping. It relates to an issue of how focused to go. We're, in our work at IPPO, using them for fairly focused questions like housing conversion in cities, or do you try and do the entire, capitalist economic system or something? There's a question of whether these are sort of one-off exercises or living ones. And I think right at the beginning, Alex said, ideally they end up as a living thing, but it turns out to be very hard to get people to use them in everyday practice. So what's our learning about how you make them embedded in daily decision-making and not just a one-off workshop? How participatory? Obviously, in an ideal world, everyone takes part in everything, but that's costly and takes time. Are there any notions of what an optimum might be? A couple of people asked a technology question. I've seen some efforts to use virtual reality or other kind of immersive spaces, so you actually walk around the system, but none of those have really taken off. Or 3D, where might technology be taking us? And how do these methods link to things like social network analysis, where you map the human system as well as the system in other senses? There were a couple of questions about uses in policy. If you're interested, I wrote a book 15 years ago called The Art of Public Strategy with quite a lot of examples of how we'd use them for things like fisheries policy or regeneration policy. The methods were much less attractive than the ones now in terms of visuals, but they were actually used to drive quite large-scale decisions. So maybe looping back to you, Alex, which of those questions would you like to touch on? And I should say, with all of these questions, if someone on the call has an answer, please put it in the chat. We will share all the chat and all the links with everyone, so don't worry, you're going to miss something. Alex.
Gosh, okay, so I'm not sure I can remember that list of questions. So I guess, well, maybe the participatory angle is quite an interesting one. I think you could say this about a lot of the questions. Is it really, there isn't an optimum amount of participation. There isn't an optimum system boundary to focus on, in general in systems mapping. I think you always want to be able to design your process and use the methods that fit your context, and that will be the needs of the users you're working with, but also their sort of blind spots and constraints. So as I think in the DEFRA example, that was a very interesting one, because DEFRA couldn't bring in farmers and stakeholders. They were not open to doing so. They're very protective around the policy. So we had to adapt. We really knew that the stakeholder perspectives needed to be in there. But the way we had to do that was by getting them to think about what stakeholders might care about. So running an extra workshop on what stakeholders would actually want. And then we were able to go through the process when this sort of came out in the analysis of the map that this was important, or that stakeholder interests might be being affected by policies in negative ways, and the constraints that stakeholders like their farmers and land managers faced. This actually prompted them to go and do more work, more social science work out in the field. And so it opened up that domain. Even though we couldn't get those people in the room, we found ways around that. So, and I think that made them more open actually to participatory work in future. So it's always, there's not an optimum, there's a kind of nuanced craft of working with situations, I think, for a lot of this. And I'd say that could answer, that would be the case in many of the questions that you asked. Making these things usable and living processes, from the start, show in the process of mapping, in the analysis, how it's usable, generate insights from the very first workshop, really connect to what your users need and show how you can use it in different ways as you go through, right from the word go.
Maybe anything on technology? Do you think in 5 years' time, what might have changed in terms of the tools?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there's lots and lots of sort of automated analysis processes coming up, and we've tried to do sort of VR stuff ourselves, things of that sort. I think, I don't know, I'm quite old-fashioned about this, and I think it's because there's a real danger when you translate things into more sort of more technical interfaces or contexts, that you get drawn in or seduced by the kind of power of the model or the interface, and the map starts to look like truth, like objective truth, rather than a collection of people's mental models, subjective object that contains perspectives and that you've actually done together with post-it notes and piece of paper. And I think keeping that perspective, that this is actually a kind of set of mental models, it's not an objective mathematical model, is really crucial. So we need to, whatever we go forward with this, we need to keep that balance in place, that we don't give these things the status of predictive models, that we interrogate them and we're constantly reflecting on their status in that regard. So,
yeah, I think there used to be a rule, almost the more beautiful the map looks, the less useful it is, because it looks too finished and perfect.
Yeah,
and people think it's a statement rather than a method. Viliana, you can choose which questions to focus on.
Yeah, I just remembered one question that really resonated with me, which is around the mapping as a living piece of work, and Alex touched a little bit on it. I feel like there are two aspects of it, and we are always thinking about it and always struggling with it as well. But I feel like there's two pathways. There is the actual map, and how do you keep the organizations using that map as a tool. And we've seen some examples from our clients. Some of them have introduced it into their onboarding for every new person joining the organization. Some of them have really printed it everywhere. It's like there is more physical ways of continuing to use the map. We have actually our very first map that we created 4 years ago. We recently got contacted back about it. It's like, oh, can we update it? Now we've done so much work in that system. We really want to have another view. So there is that. But for me, it's actually the process. The really biggest value of this system mapping is the process and the practicing of systems thinking. And that practice, once practiced enough, becomes the usual way of thinking. And then people even start drawing their little causal loops. And I have seen it with so many of our stakeholders that we have worked with, which has been probably the coolest thing. And finally, what I mentioned as well is that because of our processes are so participatory and co-creative, I would say every single person who's participated in the creation of a system map owns that system map, and they have then gone on and used it for so many different things. Like every day I learn about our maps being used in different fields, and for teaching, for creating a new product, for innovation in farming, things that I would have never intended, consciously to use them for. So I think it's the process that's really, really the key bit to keeping it a living piece of work.
So maybe I could turn that into a question for Tom. So this is a very common theme in business and in government. The more people participate, the more they own, the more they understand the map. But by definition, big businesses, governments are very hierarchical organizations, and it's very hard getting the time of the people at the top to take part in those processes. And therefore, they often work very well at a kind of middle level, but they don't actually drive some of the key decisions because the key decision makers, the ministers, etc., aren't taking part in the process. Is there any way around that dilemma? Tom.
Good question. I mean, it's tricky, right? And I don't think there's a kind of silver bullet, but I think you probably can see, at least in the experience of kind of the civil service and government in the UK, I think there has been a real step change in the last sort of 3 or 4 years or so on how systems thinking and systems mapping is used within government. And if you look at some of the work that's happened within the net zero space in particular, there's some really good systems mapping work and some systems tools that have been extended to civil servants off the back of the net zero strategy that are actually quite usable. And I think part of that comes from having buy-in about actually what's the purpose of this. It's not necessarily that everybody needs to buy into every aspect of individual maps in themselves. It's about how are they being used? What's the objective we're trying to do here? It's how you're trying to tell that story, as quite a few people have said, and describe how the system works, but also have a kind of shared understanding of that. And as long as you're kind of agreeing that that's your objective, you can kind of push some of it down a little bit. It's kind of that higher level bit I think you have to get people bought into. I mean, other people on the call may have some other views on that, but that would be my perspective.
And Roisin and Alice, what questions would you like to answer? There's lots of interest, Roisin, in perhaps applying what you did on opioids. For what it's worth, 20 years ago, the Cabinet Office did a systems map on the drugs market in the UK, which was a really interesting exercise, never published, looking at the economic dynamics, the social dynamics, the cultural, the trade, etc., etc. So as an ideal topic. What have you concluded are the best kind of topics where these sort of mapping exercises work?
That's a difficult question to answer because I think that you can use a mapping exercise in every topic, to be quite frank. And what I've found particularly useful is creating narratives around particular aspects. So creating a transparent access to information. So if someone says to me, you've done a systems map, let's see the whole thing. Great, here it is. But actually, when I go to a conversation with a group of healthcare professionals, I might approach that conversation armed with certain infographics that pull up certain aspects of that map that are probably the most relational or relevant to those people. Unfortunately, we all live in a quite difficult world where we're all strapped for time, and so I think it's also about taking the time to use your systems map to display a narrative to people that's going to be the most valuable and beneficial for them to take the action that they can take within their sphere of power, and actually being open to being challenged if you assess that wrong. So, using your convening power, but also being very open to a sort of iterative process where someone says to you, actually, I think I can influence here. And you say, great, let's pull that up and talk through that together. Has been the most sort of helpful for me, I think.
And one little additional point, which actually no one's quite made, but it was just put in the chat just then. It's possible these are most useful where topics cut across silos and they help force you to attend to really the diversity of influences on a topic. So you escape from the traps of just being an economist or a business person or a social policy person and see things in an interconnected way. And Alice, is this just part of mainstream education now? Does anyone doing an MBA learn this stuff automatically? Any undergraduates? Or how far are we from this becoming just a universal sort of meta language?
I'd say it's still quite far. We're getting closer, which is great. And one of the key things that we try to get over to students is that we don't need to strive for perfection. I know that's a hard thing to do. We're all working in careers where maybe we're writing white papers, but it's more about the toolkit and thinking about the agency that each student has in their local community or whatever area they go on to work in. This approach can be beneficial. The key thing is just having an open mind, and several people have written in the chat as well. Obviously, as soon as you create a systems map, it possibly goes out of date. So they're like living and breathing organisms, is the way that we see them. Obviously, if we can revisit them, that's great. But we can also maybe use that as a record of a point in time, and it doesn't mean it's invalid. It's taking this open-minded approach.
Great. So I'll give each of you 20 or 30 seconds of a final comment you want to make to the audience. And then just one other little point which you could reflect on, which Jeremy and I put in our little piece, is some things are a system in the classic sense of interconnected elements which really influence each other all the time. And that's what one learns in engineering about electricity systems or telephone systems. But that's slightly different from thinking systematically or in a systems way about much more diffuse things like politics or healthcare or whatever. And we do sometimes conflate those two, but they are somewhat different in practice. And maybe we need a slightly differentiated language. But how about, 30 seconds each, very, very, just of a final thought. Alex, start with you.
Final thought is, I think that there's just such huge potential here, but the real core question, as you say, is how to get systems level thinking from the middle layers up to the top, and I think that's what all of us are striving for. So more collaboration, cooperation, and sharing of methods and insights into practice to try to achieve that goal is what we really need, I think.
And one day there might even be training for politicians, heaven forbid. At the moment, they're the only group who have basically no training at all in anything. Viliana.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to Donella Meadows and her leverage points. And if you remember how the highest leverage point is around paradigm shift, and how that paradigm shift for an individual can happen in a split second. It can be in that, like, looking at the system map and realizing, wow, it is actually pretty connected, and and my interventions need to be connected as well. So that's that split second for an individual can be very powerful. For society, it's like something that we resist so much. But I do hope that these systems maps do spark these insights in some key decision makers. What my now quest is, how do we bring the system map to different ways of understanding complexity? So sometimes some people don't really like maps and computers, and sometimes it's about really understanding it with your senses. How do we bring that through theater and games and other means? So this is what I'm busy with. If you have any theater experts here, help us bring system mapping to that.
Yeah, and embodying it sometimes can be useful. Yeah. Tom, we've just got time, one sentence each from each of you. Tom?
The only thing I would say is have a go. There's definitely a big kind of hurdle of knowledge, and you look at some of the examples out there that look horribly complex, and actually you can start and go kind of quite a long way with quite a little. That's my quick.
Yeah, thanks. Alice, one sentence, final sentence.
Yeah, just I guess from my perspective, think about maybe how you can work with different generations, work with young people. We found that approach really work, where students are helping organizations doing this work who are short on time, but they have all the knowledge, and that partnership can work really well. So maybe think about that in your work. Roisin?
You've created a network here, so use it. And then I think my other sort of little tidbit would be just it's okay to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and to sit with that for a little while.
Thank you all so much for presenting and answering questions, and everyone who's taken part and contributed to the chat. We will try and distill some of this collective intelligence and maybe come back to this, perhaps a longer session. I know we've been very pressed for time, but we wanted to give a flavor of a lot of different methods here. No one showed the Afghanistan US Army map, which is a kind of model of what not to do. So complex, it had no effect on decision-making at all, but done well. This is a really useful set of tools just for understanding the world as it is, and the world is systemic. The world does not follow the logic of prose, sentences, and paragraphs. So thank you all very much for joining us, and hopefully all stay in touch. Take care. Have a good afternoon.